Hi, welcome to Flight Test. I'm TJ. This is the build video for our FT270 frame. This is the exact build that we use that is actually getting us up to 13 minutes on the battery that we've been flying with, which is a 4-cell 2800 milliamp. It is a brick. This thing is not light, but like I said, in hard flying conditions, we're getting 6-7 minutes. In a cruising, chasing an airplane type scenario, we're actually getting over 10 minutes of flight with this. And another cool thing that I like about it is we designed a plate for the top where you can actually install a gimbal and get some really awesome footage. So get your things together and we'll get started. All right, we're ready to start the build. And before we started, I want to just kind of lay everything out nice and pretty. You don't have to do this step, but I wanted to talk quickly about the two different top plates we have. We have the small one, which is what you typically see on any kind of race quad build, you know, in some form or another. So this is if we're wanting to use just a GoPro session, no GoPro, whatever. We'll use this one, which is what we're going to use today. But we also include this plate here, which is probably different than anything you've really seen. The gimbal that we use, the Quantum gimbal, made by Flite. It's really affordable. I think it's like $125, but the mounting pattern is right along with these holes. So in these kits, what I'm going to start doing is we're going to include the bobbins that I actually use for my gimbal. And then all you do is once you purchase a gimbal, you'll be able to use this plate to mount it to the front of your quadcopter. And it's going to give you some really awesome looking shots. But with that out of the way, we're not going to use this, so we'll just put it to the side. And we can finally start to put the frame together. There's a couple different plates. This is our plate that the battery rests on. This is our bottom plate, another bottom plate. So the way it'll work is you have this one on the very bottom. I like having a gremlin on the outside, and then our arms are going to kind of sandwich between these. So the easiest way that I've found to do it, we have a couple different size screws, and in your kit you're going to notice you have the majority of these 12mm little socket head screws. These are what goes through your arms. So we'll start off with one corner, take an arm, put the screw through it, and then our bottom plate. Now each arm has 6 holes, and this one on the outside of every arm, what's held on is one of these little, I think it's an M3 little nylock nut. I just like getting everything snugged up until all the screws are in, and then we can tighten them down. So we'll go on and do the same thing to the other side. And we'll go ahead and put the back arms on before we put the other screws in. Now that we have our nylock nuts kind of a little loose so everything can still move around, the next thing we're going to put in the same screws, except in the 2 front holes and the 2 back holes. Then we have these little shorter standoffs. These standoffs are 15mm, and there should be 6 of these. And then you also have 2 that are a little bit shorter. The biggest difference you're going to notice is the shorter ones actually don't have threads inside. These are going to be used as spacers later for our top plate. So we'll get the 15mm standoff, and same thing, we'll just finger tighten all these in place and just go all the way around. Now we have our standoff snugged up. The next 4 are going to be the inside here. It's going to use the same screws. Now, however, instead of any standoffs or anything, we're going to have these little nylon standoffs for our flight controller. And depending on how you want to set yours up, you may want to do something different, you know, whether it's a nylon nut, a bigger standoff, something. But these are what I found work really well, especially when you're doing a build like we're doing, where it's kind of a power distribution board flight controller all in one. So we'll use the same 12mm screws, slide it through, and just get these little standoffs snugged up. Now one thing about this build is as we're putting this frame together, you'll notice there's not a lot of space between the bottom plate and the plate where the battery rests. So we depending on how you want to build it. Obviously there's a million different ways, but this is just the way that I found that everything kind of fits together like a puzzle, and it looks pretty good. All right, now that all our nylon is actually tight, I'm not going to go back through and tighten it up with a screwdriver just because it'll strip out the threads, but everything else we can go through and get snugged up. So we'll start with the standoffs using a 2.5mm hex. And with the knurled standoffs, it makes it really easy just to hold the standoff and tighten it down. And also, I know in the comments we'll get a lot of questions about our tools. These are actually a Kylan tool set. We have them on the store right now. You can get, I think it's the 4-piece, which is a 1.5, 2, 2.5, and 3mm hex. And to me, that's the most affordable way to do it. And then just get regular Phillips head, flathead screwdrivers of any other type. Now that we have those tight, we'll go through and get the small nylock nuts tightened. See, since I'm on camera, it makes it a little bit harder because I got to do this on the table. If I wasn't on camera, I'd be holding the frame with my legs to balance it while I tighten these up. But don't want to go too crazy tight with it. Like I said, they're nylock, so they're not going to come back loose. I just want to tighten them down to where the nylon is engaged and we're not stripping anything out. All right, now that we have that part set up, next thing we can do is we can go ahead and install the front and the rear standoffs just so they're already ready to go. And the front and rear are all held on by the shorter screws and the little pan head tops. And the same thing on the back. So to determine the front and the back, you can either turn it over and see the gremlins on the front, or if you just look at the holes in your frame, you have 4 holes on the outside here. This is for your camera plates, and then 4 holes on the inside on the back are for, you know, if you want to use some kind of zip ties or something to hold on your receiver. So we'll use our small screws and our small standoffs for the back. And like I said, the biggest difference between the small standoff and the big standoff is these aren't threaded. So we'll switch out to the other one. Long standoff. And we'll do the longer standoffs on the front here. Now with these smaller screws, it takes a 2mm hex. We'll just snug all these up. Like I said, we don't want to go too tight with it so we don't strip out our screws. If you have some thread locker you'd like to use, now's the time to do it. I wouldn't go too crazy with it, just in case we ever need to take it back apart. And if you do use it, use the blue stuff so it will come back apart. Now we have this part done, the next thing I like to do is to install our motors. I always work from the motors out, or rather reverse that, I work from the motors in. So we'll put the motors on, then our ESCs, the flight controller, and then finally our FPV. You want to be sure to moisturize your hands. You know, I like to use this Aveeno lotion. Keeps them nice and tender. We have a couple different options for motors on the store. And really the only option I use for this frame is the F80s. I want to say these are, for me, the most efficient and really give us what we're looking for in a chase quad. Now you can buy them in the packs of 2 like this, but you can also buy them in singles. And so, you know, if you wanted to get it for the quad, you can buy 2 packs of 2 and 1 single just so you have a spare. And apparently these things are locked. That was kind of hard to open. So when you open it up, you have some spare parts here, you know, extra rings. You have your prop nuts and the screws. Actually, we have included the gunmetal prop nuts just because they look awesome. So like I said, we have our 2 motors, And this is not a bag of chiclets. Please do not eat it, throw it away. So we got our second box. Let's get everything opened up. Man, these things are not easy to open. There we go. A lot of trash. And 2 more motors. So like I said, whenever you're installing things, you can use, Loctite if you need to. But for me, I actually don't use it anymore, and I haven't found an instance of where I thought I should be using it. Just occasionally I'll go through and make sure everything's still tight, and really it usually is. Now it's always good to keep your spare parts, so if you're cleaning, if you crash, you get mud, something all in your motor, you need to pull the bell off and you accidentally lose a clip, these come with these extra little spare parts, so put these up somewhere just in case one day you may need it. You may never need it, but it's always better to have it than realize you need it and get it shipped to, a week or 2 away. And the same thing, we'll just move all these over to the side, get our motors, and we'll start installing. Just like everything else we do when we're putting in screws, we'll just kind of snug them up to allow us to move things around. Then once we have all 4 in, then we can go around, tighten them down. If you've ever changed a tire, do it the same way. You'll tighten one up, go to the other side, tighten it, tighten this one, and then the other side. And all that's doing is allowing the motor to kind of cinch down all at the same time. Get our 2.5mm hex and just snug all these up. And just like everything else, we don't want to go too tight with it to risk stripping the screws. But at the same time, if we go too loose, then we're going to end up losing things. So there's 1 motor done. We'll go on and get the other 3 installed. Alright, now with our 4 motors installed, we're ready to go. One thing that I do next is to help keep it from just kind of spinning around on the screws. So we have these 4 landing pads. So we'll go ahead and install these on the bottom of the frame, and this gives the frame something to sit on as we're working. So flip it over. And I like putting them pretty much as close to the motor screws as I can without touching. And it allows me to be able to wrap up my ESCs right beside of it. So just wipe it off, just make sure there's no dirt. And I would use a razor blade to help me take this off, but it was just stolen. Friends stealing tools. Always makes for a fun day. So we'll stick this right, like I said, as close to the motor screws without touching. And spin around, get the next one. Now that we have our blade, it makes it a little bit easier, because these are pretty sticky, which is a good thing. So wipe it off a little bit. Stick it down, and move on to the other side. With our motors installed and our landing pads on the bottom of the frame, next part we want to move on to is our ESCs. So in this build we're using the Emax Bullet series. It's a 35 amp ESC. They are a little bit bigger than like the 30 amp Bullet. So if you're planning on using only a 4-cell battery, you can get away with only using the 30 amp ESCs and be perfectly fine. The only reason I wanted to go with the 35 amp ESCs was in case I decided one day to take this either to a 5-cell or a 6-cell, which with this setup that we're building today, we can go 6-cell. The only thing is, if you do fly with a 6-cell battery, be sure and don't stay full throttle for too long, because these are a 35 amp ESC, and these motors with the prop choice that we have at full throttle and a static thrust situation, you're looking at close to 50 amps. So we'll go ahead and go through and open all these bags. In each one of these little ESC bags, you get your ESC. Emax gives us some stickers, and then there's also a little piece of heat shrink. Be sure and take your heat shrink instead of the sides, so once we get everything soldered together, we can seal up our ESCs with this. So I'll set my frame aside for right now. With the Emax ESCs, what we need to do next is go through and we want to get I use a flux pin or any kind of flux just to help the solder. And you go through, we'll put flux on all 12 of these pads, go through, pre-tin them with our solder, and then we'll be ready to work on the motors next. So whenever we put the flux on, all that's going to allow the solder to do is kind of flow more evenly and a little bit easier on the pads. So now you notice I'm using a tip that's a little bit bigger than normal, but I prefer to use a wider tip for the bigger jobs that I solder. And honestly, I'm a little lazy and I don't really swap out my tip that often. But it works just fine for pretty much everything we do. Just lay your tip on the pad, let it heat up a little bit, and then feed the solder into it. Like I said, everybody may have a little bit of different way of doing things. For me, I run my soldering iron a little hot, and it's actually right now about 755 degrees Fahrenheit, but it just allows me to not have to spend so much time on it. But it's also, you need to realize that it is a little hot. Now we have all 4 ESCs pre-tin. The next thing I want to do is just set those aside, bring your frame back into the picture, and whenever you install your motors, you want to install them so your motor wires are going along the arm. So I'm just going to pick those up out of the way, line up an ESC about where we're wanting to have it on the arm, and then we're going to measure our motor wires, leaving a little bit extra space so they're not pulled tight when we tape down our ESC. So with this one, let's say our ESC is going to be about here, so I'm actually going to cut my motor wire to right here where the heat sink is on the top, so this white line. So just lay it out, take our wire cutters, and you cut the one, and you can actually just cut the other 2 to that same length here. Now we're going to go around and do the other 3 motors the same way. Just lay the wires on top of your ESC here, and if you cut one, it'll make it easy just to cut the other 2 right along with it. You either keep the bits of wire for another project or just throw them away. Now that we have all 12 motor wires cut to the correct length, now we can go through and just strip off a little bit of the silicone, just expose some of the bare wire. And I like doing all this in kind of one step, so I'll strip it off and just twist the wire up. And so that'll be done to all 12 before we come back through and pre-tin our wires. You don't have to strip off too much, maybe just like 2, maybe 3 millimeter, just enough to solder onto the pads without leaving a lot of extra wire that is not protected off of the ESC. If you have too much exposed, then all you're doing is setting yourself up for possible shorts. Alright, now that we have all 12 motor wires stripped and twisted, we can go through and pre-tin the wires, and all that's doing is just heating them up, putting the solder to it, letting the solder soak through, and getting them ready for the ESCs. So a little bit of solder on the tip of your iron, heat up the wire, and then feed the solder onto the wire. Take a minute to heat the wire up because these are a little bit thicker. One motor done. And if you notice any little pieces of wire kind of hanging off of the ends, just twist them up inside the wire again, because all it takes is one little piece to touch something it's not supposed to, and then all of a sudden you have a burnout motor or ESC. Now we have all of our motor wires tinned and set up for the ESCs. So next step, what we can do is go through, get our ESCs lined up, and solder all the motor wires onto the ESCs. Now the order that your motor wires are soldered doesn't really matter, so we'll just solder all of them direct, and then later within the BL Heli software, we can actually change motor directions if we need to. So when we're installing our ESCs, at least for me, when I'm trying to get everything soldered into place, the ESC tends to like to wobble around on us. And instead of just taping everything down, I like to use these. So this is our new quad hands, and this thing is amazing. What I like about it is they're all magnetic. So you can move them around to wherever we want, and what it does is allows us to use like the longer ones to come down, move them however you need it. Put your ESC on it, and it's going to hold it there nice and steady while we solder everything to it. Now for these parts, when the wires get shorter, it gets hotter faster, and you don't want to be holding with your fingers, so I like using my little flat tweezers here to help us along. Pull up the one wire, pull the ESC down a little bit closer, and just apply the heat to the wire, and since both of them are pre-tinned, they will kind of melt together and give us a good bond. The only difference is I want to get a little bit more of that wire onto the ESC. And for the third one, good. So you can see how the quad hands here come in really good handy. You know, I guess handy, funny. But again, they are magnetic. So like this little tin thing here, I can stick it to it and just kind of change any kind of angle. And so you don't even have to use the base if we don't want to. But not to sound too pitchy, quadhands.com, we don't actually carry these on the store yet, but I think I kind of want to. So we have the one ESC soldered up to our motor, and this is where our heat shrink is going to come into play. So before we do anything else with this ESC or any more, we'll take our heat shrink, slide the heat shrink down over the ESC, kind of get into place here, and use our heat gun, and a little bit of a bubble here. You got to make it look nice because we're going to be covering it up with tape here shortly. So next thing we can do is when we're installing our ESCs, I like to leave a little bit of slack in my motor wires here before we tape it into place. So let's cut off a little piece of electrical tape here. Make sure that slack is left in our motor wire. Now one thing I have found out is if we stretch our tape too tight, then it's going to constantly be pulling on itself, and you'll notice it's starting to pretty much lift up. So we leave it a little loose. I'm going to try to get it all overlapped pretty close. And like I said, we don't want it too tight, but yeah, we still have a little bit of wiggle room here. So there's one ESC done. So with one done, we can move on and get the other three knocked out. Now one thing to note, you know, usually on like my race quads or 5-inch freestyle, the ones that we're going to be pretty much crashing and bashing around, I always like to put some kind of, you know, whether it's double-sided tape or just a piece of foam, just something under the ESC. With our chase quad, we don't really plan to crash these or fly these as hard as like a freestyle quad or a race quad, so I don't really worry about putting anything under the ESCs. We already heat shrunk that one, so I was just going to double it up. So yeah, instead of putting anything under it, I'll just line it up, make sure my motor wires have a little slack, and then we tape them into place. And so far, you know, over the past year, this really hasn't been an issue on our chase quads. So same thing as earlier, put the tape in place. Don't want to stretch it too tight. Leaves a little bit of wiggle room. Alright, 2 ESCs out of the way, and the same thing again. Now for something you do different than something you see me doing in this video and you think it would help us out, or you think your way is a little bit better, definitely let us know in the comments. Nobody's perfect, and we can always learn. So we have our third ESC, we'll get our heat shrink, and same thing again. Get it fed down over the wires, get it put in place, and we'll shrink it into place here. Alright, that was our last heat shrink. So now, just like before, give us a little bit of flex in our motor wire, a piece of electrical tape. So now in the middle you can see we have this giant mess of wires, and all of these will be getting connected into our flight controller. Alright, our next step, we're going to be using our DYS F4 flight controller. Just open it up. The cool thing I like about these is they come with a pretty awesome battery lead, but they also have a buzzer. And I like these little micro buzzers so much that we actually sell these separate on the store, and they go with our Gremlins or pretty much anything you want to put a buzzer on. So it comes with a little hardware kit here that we actually don't really need to use any of it, but we will use the little vibration dampeners, and there's some nylon nuts in here that if you want to use those, but your kit actually comes with them, so that's not necessary. It's just spare parts we can put in the bin for later. So lay it all out here. See the little rubber O-rings, just pull 4 of those out, and everything else we can just put in a bin. Throw our trash away. Now on the bottom of the DYS flight controller, it's made to plug directly into a DYS 4-in-1 ESC, so we don't need these pins here. So I always just snip those off, just one at a time. Be sure not to point it towards your eyes, because when they come off they like to fly. So you can either do it into a container. So get those nice and flush. As long as they don't touch the carbon, we're okay. So get all those done. And next thing we're going to do is install our little rubber vibration dampeners. Now these actually go inside of these holes. So always squeeze it, put one corner in, kind of roll it around to help it get through. And it pops right in. So get all 4 of these on. Now one good thing in this kit, if you do happen to tear one of your vibration dampeners in half or something, they do include a couple extra. So all 4 done. And next thing we can do is go through with our flux, get everything nice and tinned, ready to go. Now they do have through hole connectors on the board, so you can put the wires through it and then solder them. For me, what I've been doing is just treating these just like pads, pre-tinning them, laying the wire right on top, and then soldering it down. So whichever way you find works better for you is perfectly acceptable. So we'll go through, get it all tinned up, and we'll be ready for our next step. And this is another point where the board will move around on us, so bring the quad hands back in. And for something like this, we can use the shorter ones. These magnets are really tough. Go through with the solder, or the flux rather. First ones we're going to do are all of our ESC pads here. So same thing, warm up the pad and feed the solder onto it. Now you'll notice we also have a negative and a signal, the little round pads. You don't really need to run the negative if you don't want to, so we will actually just cut ours off here, so you have a negative here and the signal here. So the circle pads, the inside pads, are your signals. So we'll put a little drop of solder on all of our signal pads. And we'll come back here, go ahead and do the signal pads while we're at it. And then we'll get our ESC power pads real fast. Now that we have those done, next thing we want to do is determine which pads we're going to need. So you see an arrow here, this is the front of our board, and then you'll notice the pads along the side actually aren't marked. So the best thing to do is it comes with a little manual here. Open up your manual and there is a picture that tells you exactly what all of these pads do. Now it's really small to read, so for me what I did is I actually brought it up on our computer screen to make it a little bit easier to see. So according to the computer screen, for our VTX and camera, it all is going to be on the left side, and our receiver and buzzer is all going to be on the right side. Now this does have the Betaflight OSD, so your camera and VTX are on separate pads. That way it goes through the OSD before it comes to your goggles. And then over on the right side, depending on what kind of receiver you're going to use, is going to determine which pads you use here. And also we're going to be using smart audio, and it'll be on the left side. So according to our schematic, I want to run my VTX, since it's a TBS and can run up to 6 cell. I've realized that these boards do have pretty good filtering, so I'll run it straight off of battery voltage, which is the bottom right pad here, and then ground is right beside that pad. And then our VTX needs video out, so it'll be 3 holes up is our video out. And then our camera, we can run it on 5 volt, so just the opposite up here at the top would be ground on the inside. 5 volt is next, and then our video in is the third one down. So the third hole's down, you got video in on the inside, video out on the outside. So we'll go through, we can get all these pre-tinned, and then looking on the right side, the same thing. We need the 3 volt pad for, since we are running a Spectrum satellite, which is this center pad here. Ground on the bottom, and then we'll be wiring into the S bus, which is the open hole 2 up here. And then our buzzer is the 2 open bottom here. So it's a lot to look at, and when we're talking about it like this, just the point of it was it can get a little overwhelming. So when you're building it, you want to do one step at a time. So whenever we go through, we'll get our VTX wires out and we'll concentrate on the VTX. Then we'll concentrate on our camera, and just, you know, so on and so forth. So just don't let it overwhelm you. Just take it one step at a time. So the very next thing we can do is actually we'll line this up on our Flite controller, and we can start with ESC pads, pretty much however you want to start. So we'll get our frame over, pull it into here, get all of our ESC wires kind of hooked out of the way. That way we have a little bit more room to work with. Just kind of fold them under the front and back. It opens up everything in the center. And our Flite controller is going to end up sliding directly on top like this. Now, like I said, when we put our top plates on, you're going to notice there's really not a lot of room. And so we're using our VTX from TBS, which has a little bit of a pigtail here, if you can see that, and then our antenna will be on top of it. So what I like doing is getting everything kind of pre-set up. So I like setting my VTX where it goes inside its frame. Same thing with our receiver, and that pretty much allows us a little bit more flexibility when getting everything set up. Pull this out. Now if you notice, if we did put our VTX back here, now we're going to have to take our pigtail and figure out pretty much how to run it. So what I like doing on this frame is I like going ahead and getting my antenna, installing my antenna, tighten it down a little bit, remove the flight controller for now. We'll take our tape that is included in our VTX. Get the paper peeled off. I like using this one just because it's thinner and it helps it get under the flight controller a little bit. Just wipe off about where we're going to put it. So now the idea, this being the front, is our VTX. We're going to slide it up here pretty much as close to these standoffs as we can and stick it down. And what it's going to allow us to do is when our flight controller is in place, and then we bring our antenna up and heat shrink it, now we're only looking at just a little bit stuck out the back, and our receiver can be underneath. And this way we could get our flight controller in place once we have our ESCs on, and then it's going to allow us a little bit of wiggle room, but it's so much easier to go ahead and have that VTX sitting there. Now that we have our VTX secured underneath of our flight controller, I'm going to go ahead and use the little nylon nuts we have included in our frame kit. Don't want to get too tight with them, just enough to kind of squish down the rubber a little bit. This is going to help that flight controller stay in place as we're getting everything soldered to it. And now next thing I'm going to do is just get the flux. Like I said, I like to use these just as pads instead of the through hole. So I find it a little bit easier. And then I'm going to go through and pre-tin all the ones that's going to be relevant for our build. And to do that, like I said, we're just going to reference our schematic here that's pull it up on the computer. I know I'm going to want the ground and the 5 volts, so we're just going to do it on the outside. It doesn't matter which side we do, we know we only need one of each. And these are going to be for our camera. And then we're going to need the 2 middle third holes here. This is for our VTX out and our camera in. And then we're going to skip down to T6. T6 is on the inside, 4 down, and what this is going to be for is our smart audio. And what smart audio lets us do is adjust all of our functions on our VTX through our OSD. Then we need our 2 bottom ones here. So this ground and our battery voltage on the inside. Now with my bigger tip, it is a little bit harder to get in there closer for these small things, but obviously not impossible. All right, now that we have our left side pre-tinned, we'll go to the right side. And same thing, referencing our schematic here. We know that we're using Spectrum, so we're going to need the bottom 2 outside. And this is our ground and 3.3 volt. So ground, 3.3. The 2 bottom open holes are for our buzzer. So we'll get those tinned up. And then S-bus is one above the buzzer on the outside. And that should be good enough for now. So we have everything on our flight controller pre-tinned and ready to go. And at this point, it's really however you want to start, we can start. So for me, what I'm going to do is we'll start with our battery connection, move out, get all of our ESCs on, and that'll be our next step. We'll get our battery connector. And for me on this frame, the way I like to do it is I like to have my battery connector just coming out the side, and then whenever we Velcro down our battery, we'll just Velcro the battery connector along with that, and it keeps it from moving around and accidentally getting caught in our props. So the best way to go about it is if we look at our board or our schematic, either way you want to go, on the right side it actually says B+, so that is our positive for our battery, and a G for the ground. So we'll take our battery lead, kind of bend it towards the direction it's going to be going, line up our wires. So that looks pretty good there. So with our wires lined up, we're just going to hold them in place, Get our wire cutters, and we're going to cut them just to the back side of those pads. And that's just going to allow us to have a little bit extra room. And you'll notice one's a little bit longer than the other, and all that's doing is allowing for the bend. So we'll strip these, twist them, get our battery leads tinned up, and then we'll solder them to the board. Just like earlier, we don't need too much stripped, just enough. Pull our quad hands back in, and just use it to get everything held up there. So clean our tip off, and just like everything else here, we'll tin it up a little bit. Get our wire heating up, and then we'll feed our solder into the wire. Pull our frame back in, and just remember our positives going on the right pad. And like anything else, when we're soldering a wire, I like to use my tweezers. Lay it in place, apply heat to it, and allow it to melt together. And get our ground in place. Same thing. As our battery leads in, whenever we put our top plate on, we'll just feed it out to the side here, and it'll be right up along the side of the frame. But for now, we'll just lay it back in the center. And this part, we can go through and get all of our ESCs ready to go. So we'll start on this side. And another thing we like about this Flite controller is all the ESCs go directly to the relevant corners. So it makes it a little bit easier and takes out some of the guesswork. Now, like I spoke about earlier, is we're not going to be using the signal grounds. So what we do is actually just go through, and this is a step that we should have probably done earlier, but honestly, every single time I've built one of these, I've forgot until this step. So I just go through and clip the ground off, just right under the heat shrink, and then we'll pull it off here shortly. Just be sure not to get your signal wire. It's not the end of the world, we can fix it, but it just makes things a little bit longer. So we'll go back around here to the ESC we're going to start with. Keep everything else out of the way. And the best way to go about it is either looking at your schematic or on the board. On the outside, this corner is negative and voltage positive is on the inside. And obviously our signal's here. The way I find it easier to work is instead of putting the negative on first and then having to fight between the two wires to get the positive in, we'll work from the inside out. So we'll do the positive first, the negative, and then finally come in for our signal wire last. So with that said, we can lay everything out, get it out of the way. Our positive is going in first, so we'll leave a little slack. And all this slack is going to allow us to do is later, if we need to change a VTX or something, it's going to allow us to lift our board up just enough to get it pulled out of the way. So we'll line it up, take our snips, cut it just on the back side of that pad. But before you cut it, pull it up and then snip it. And same thing here. Line the ground up just on the back side of the pad, pull it up, and then snip it. The only reason we're pulling up out of the way before we close the cutters is in case you accidentally have one of these little components in between, you don't want to cut it. Now we're going to line up our signal. Just pull the ground out of the way because like I said, we're not going to use it. Just line up the signal, same way. We're going to shorten it down to just on the back side of that pad, and then we can throw this piece away. Now the next step we're going to do is just go through. Going to strip off just a little bit of the wires, twist them up, and then tin them. So once we have it stripped off, twist all three, go through, tin them all up. Now with them all tinned, like I said, we'll start from the inside and work our way to the outside. So on the inside it'll be positive. So using our tweezers, we'll line it up. Apply some heat. It's in. Then we'll do the ground. And then finally come through and get the signal in, being sure not to really get anything else. Spin it around here. Hold on top of the little solder bubble and then just apply just a little bit of heat, and it's pretty quick. Need to adjust it, just takes a little touch to get it to move, and that one's down. So with that ESC done, now we can move on and do the same thing to the other three. Order doesn't matter, just by paying attention here. On this one, our ground is on the inside, positive is on the outside. Exactly opposite of what our last one was, so be sure you check what goes where. So I'll line up our ground, get our snips here. That one. Positives on the outside. And finally line our signal up and done. And we're just going to go ahead and get all of them cut down the size and get them all soldered in at once. Now with all of them cut to size, we can just go through, strip all of them, get them twisted up and ready to solder. All our ESC wires pre-tinned. Now we can just go through and get everything stuck down, working from the inside out. So on this one here, it's our front left motor. The negative is on the inside. If you're starting with a different one, just be sure you're looking to see which pad what goes to. So negative here, and then we have positive, which is next. Finally with our signal. Remember, the smaller the wire, the less heat it really takes to get it to solder into place. So the signal wires just take a little touch. And again, inside to out, so positives first. Then our negative. Adjust that one just a little bit. And then our signal. Got one more to go. Spin it around. It's like negative is on the inside for this. Positives on the outside. And then finally our last signal. Now that we have all 4 ESCs soldered into place, next thing we can move on to is our buzzer and receiver. So we'll start over here on this right side. And really it doesn't matter which one we start with, so we'll go ahead and start with our receiver. And for our build, we're just using the SPM 4648 DSMX. Just serial receiver, really simple to set up, auto binds. It's just been really good for us, and this is what we kind of use on pretty much any quadcopter here lately. So open it up. Now another option you have is to use the Spectrum telemetry receiver. We're not using it today, but it's still a good option, especially if you're using like a DX9 or something where your radio can actually talk to you and give you telemetry updates. Now we don't need all of this wire, so let's get about half of it and go ahead and cut it off, so instead of spending 5 minutes pulling it out of the package. Now the way I like doing this is plugging it in first. So moving our battery lead out of the way, moving our antenna out of the way just enough so they're not blocking our space here. But what I do like to do is just a little bit of double-sided tape on the bottom of our receiver, and we can get it stuck down. But before we do that, take our wire for our receiver, feed it underneath of our flight controller, and that's going to allow us to solder up and over the side. So let's put that out of the way. So let's get a little piece of double-sided tape here. If you have hot glue, use hot glue, just whatever is on hand. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. Put a little piece here. Put the paper off. And stick it into place. I'll give myself just a little bit of wiggle room here. Now, you'll see that the holes line up actually on both sides of the receiver, so if you wanted to use zip ties you could. I just like double-sided tape, seems to work out pretty well for us. And now look at our schematic again. Notice it's ground on the bottom, 3 volt, and then skipping the first solder bubble to our S-bus. And then our wiring here, gray is signal, black is ground, and red or orange, whichever color you see, is our power. So we'll just untwist them here. Just like we've done everything else, we want to leave a little bit of slack, line it up to the solder, and we'll cut it just on the back side. So there's one. And just to save us a little bit of headache, we'll go ahead and do these one at a time. The way I like doing it is holding it on the side of the flight controller with my thumb, just to keep it from moving, and adding a little bit of pressure so we don't actually pull it out of the connector. Getting our wire strippers and pulling off just a little bit of the heat shrink. Twist it up. Now with the Spectrum satellite receiver, these are plastic coated wires, so you don't want to have too much heat on them because it will melt the plastic. Just a little bit of solder and just a quick little touch. Same thing, we don't want to put too much heat on it in this step either, so just use our tweezers. We'll bend it over, get it lined up, and just a little bit of heat to get it stuck down. So there's our ground. Next one we'll do is move on to our positive, and the same thing we just did. We'll line it up, get it cut to size, hold it against the flight controller with our thumb, strip off just a little bit, twist it together, apply a little bit of solder, and get it stuck down. So our power and ground is good for our satellite receiver. Next thing we're going to do is the same thing for our signal, which is going to be this top solder bubble. And just like we've done twice before, line it up, cut the size, hold it down, strip off just a little bit. Using our tweezers, we'll get it held into place and solder down. So our receiver is now connected. So the next thing we can do is, while we're working on the side, we'll get our buzzer. Now you can do this a few different ways. You know, you can place your buzzer pretty much wherever you would like it. For me, I don't want to use more glue or tape than I have to. So what I tend to do is just kind of feed my wires around the outside here, pull it to where my buzzer is kind of just sitting there in the middle. And like I said, you can either use, you know, a little hot glue, a little tape, something to hold it in there, but once we get it soldered into place, this buzzer's not going to go anywhere. So looking at our schematic, it looks like negative is on the inside and positive is on the outside. So we're going to go outside to inside this time, because the way it'll work is we'll get our positive soldered in, and then our negative will actually lay right over top of it to solder to the inside. So like we've done a few times, we'll line it up, kind of make sure our buzzer's still in the middle, find our snips just on the back side of the pad, Now these are really small wires, so just like we've been doing, we'll hold it up against the side. Be very careful not to cut all the way through the wire. I don't have wire snips or wire strippers that are this small, so just kind of have to do it with a little bit of finesse. Twist that up, a bit of solder on the tip of it. I'm going to stick it down to the outside pad. A real quick heat. And now the last part is getting our ground lined up for the inside pad. Cut to size. And same thing, still small wires, so just be careful when we're stripping it that we don't want to cut all the way through. And like I said, I just did cut all the way through, but it's not a big deal because we leave us a little extra for things like that. So twist it together. A bit of solder. And just double checking, so we do go to the inside pad. Just kind of line it up over here. And stick it in place. So our ground is in. Just want to do a quick check just to make sure nothing's touching. Everything looks good there. So our next step we're going to do is our VTX and camera. Now the TBS does a really good job with already including connectors for our cameras. Yeah, I've already got it plugged into the VTX. However, since we are using the onboard on-screen display, the OSD, we're not going to use this connector. Although it can power 5 volt to the camera, you know, everything, we want to use our full capability of this OSD. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and cut off this connector because we don't need it. And we're going to feed out our wiring. So the white one will be for smart audio, so it's going to come down here to those connectors. We'll need our video out, so that's going to be this yellow wire. And then this red and black will be our 5 volt and our ground for our camera. However, we're not going to need these, so we can actually just cut these off or pull them out with the connector. But since we're not going to need them, I just always cut them flush. Just cut this ground off. So we'll need the white and the yellow, and then the one with the red connector on it, this takes our actual battery voltage. So we're going to need these two anyway, so we'll cut that connector off. And referring back to our schematic, we know that the ground and the positive for our VTX is these two bottom solder bubbles here, and then the outside center is for our video out, and this middle solder bubble on the bottom is for the white wire. So all 4 of these are going to come up and around the outside just like we did our receiver. So I find it easier just to bring them up, twist them together. Kind of helps us feed them through. And then we'll just squish them through the bottom. And they tend to like to get hung on things. So if you can't get them through all together, we can just go one at a time. Makes it a little bit easier. And if you have problems getting them through, you can always unscrew your flight controller and lift it up a little bit. Alrighty. With our 4 wires through the side here, now we can go through, cutting to size, stripping, and getting everything put into place. So the first one we're going to want to do will be our ground on the bottom outside, so our black wire. And we'll just pull it out of the mix here, line it up, same thing, hold it in place, cut to size, and strip the end off, just like the other ones. These are a little bit too small for my strippers, so just be careful when pulling them apart. Tin the tip of it, and again the bottom outside is for the ground, so we'll just hold it over, get it soldered into place. And the next one will be our red wire for our positive. Same thing, goes on the inside. So just want to hold it in place. Cut it to size. Tin it up. And solder it down. So we got our positive and negative down. Next one we're going to go to is the white wire, which is going to be for our smart audio, and it's going to be on T6, which means it's going to be UART6 in the software when we get to that point later. So just hold it in place, trim it down, strip off just a little bit, hold it in place, and stick it down. So we have everything but one more. And so this one, like we said earlier, is going to be video out, and just double checking again on the outside middle. That is where that one will go. So we'll hold it in place, trim it down just a little bit off the top, and get it soldered into place here. Alright, now we have our VTX in. The next step is going to be to install our FPV camera, and that's where these happy little angry plates come into play. It's always fun when you design something and it turns out to be mad at you. So we'll pull out our camera. The camera we're using is the Flite Test Edition Runcam Swift 2, and obviously we put our name on it, so we must like it. So pull the camera out. Comes with a spare little body here, so you can put that away in case you need it at a later time. And that's all we're going to need out of the box. So now in our bag, this is where all the hardware and wiring is. Go ahead and dump all this out. We don't need our camera mount. We do need the screws. And then you have a few different selections of wires here. If we were going to use this camera, and it does have its own built-in OSD to where it can tell us voltage, we would use this wire system here, but we're not going to use this because we don't need it. We just need the 3 wires for positive, ground, and video. So we can go ahead and get this plugged into our camera. If you read on the back, it tells you power's on the outside, ground and video. Even though it's a bigger connector, you just line it up on the left side and plug it in. And then one other thing I want to do is, before we get anything installed and put together, one of the last steps I always do is adjusting the camera settings. And really the only thing we're adjusting is the OSD. So we're going to turn the OSD off on the camera itself, so we get our OSD cable plugged in, and just leave it in until we're done setting up the OSD later. So it's set just like that. So these wires, we can put them away for another project. Open up our hardware bag. Just dump everything out. We want our 2mm driver, and we got a few different options on screws here. The ones we're going to be wanting to use are these ones that have like a pan head with a pretty thin threading on it. These are what's going to be used to hold our camera in place as well as adjust the tilt. So the way I like to do it is put the screw into the nose of our mad little man, line up the camera, and just kind of snug it up without getting it tight. We don't want the camera plate to be tight yet. So put that in, and we'll get the second screw and put it in right here on the back. A little magnetic screwdriver is really come in handy for this. So we'll get it lined up with our tilting, and same thing. We want it to be able to move freely. because once we get the other side on, then we'll determine our camera tilt and get them both tightened down at the same time. All right, like I said, what we're going to do now is stand our camera plates up flat on the table, determine what kind of camera tilt you want. So for a chase quad, we usually don't go over like 25 degrees, which is probably right around there. And depending on what we're chasing, it may go up, it may go down, but a good rule of thumb is around 20-25 degrees. Don't really need much more. So we'll hold the camera in place just by squeezing on the plates, and then I'm going to tighten down the back screw first to hold that angle on that plate. And then we're going to turn around and do the same thing here. So just line it up, hold the camera in place, tighten down the back screw, and with both back ones tight, now it won't move. So now we can just snug up the center ones. Alright, camera plates are installed. So we pull our frame back in, get rid of this excess hardware. Now, whenever I'm doing the camera, all the camera wires are going to come right over top. The one thing you want to remember, to get your camera installed into the slots, is our top plate. This top plate in particular, I guess you can call it the middle plate, is going to be laying right here. So when we put our camera in, if we want to go less tilt or more tilt, we're going to need to allow for that. So I like to get my camera wires lined up, push them down in behind the camera, just so we have that extra. And then we can line up our wires and cut them down to size. And then also, while we're doing all this, take our OSD and we'll lay it out of the way, so whenever we install everything, the OSD wire is going to be laying out between the standoffs, and so once we adjust our camera, we can just pull it back out. So what we'll do is we'll move on and get our camera lined up, get the wires cut to size and soldered in. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut them down a little bit to start. And looking at our schematic one more time, we notice the ground is the top outside, so we'll just line it up. We can just cut it flush with the side of the flight controller. We do the same thing with the positive, which is next in line. And the video in from our camera is on the inside. So just line it up with that inside bubble and cut it down. So we'll just do all three at the same time. Go through, strip off the ends, just enough. Don't have to get crazy with it. And tin them all up. Now we're going to run our wires from the inside to the out. So our ground was on the top, so we're just going to bring it around. So I work with soldering with my right hand, so I spun it around. We'll line up the ground in this direction, hold it into place, and just tack it down. Same thing with our positive. And then finally, just pull those wires up a little bit. Finally, we'll bring our video in, line it up on the dot, and stick it down. Now you notice I accidentally touched this other wire, and even though it's for a brief second, it actually did come up. So we'll just hold it back in place. I'm going to bend it down just a little bit and get our VTX back in. Oh, look, did it again. It's always fun. See, and this right here is why probably a good idea to have a smaller tip for these little things, but we're good, everything's in place. So now, like we talked about, we'll just take our camera wires, I just want to line them up, and I'm going to push them down here underneath our camera a little bit. And this just allows us to have the flexibility to move our camera as we need to. So next thing we're going to do is take our middle plate here, and we're going to get our antenna lined up, take our battery cable, lay it on the left side of this standoff so it comes out the side as we want it. So we're going to take our antenna, we're going to push it back just a little bit to where this connector is right between these standoffs. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow us to use these 3 holes here. We made them so you have zip tie, and then a wrap strap. And all this is included in your kit. So we'll line it up. We can just lay it up on the side. And the way it's going to work is it's going to come in just on the antenna and cinch your antenna down to that plate. Now obviously there's not a lot of wiggle room since we do have it this direction, but it's enough to be able to get it tightened down without putting too much force on your VTX. So if you have to, you can always lean it up on the side, however we need to do it to be able to get it in. So we'll take our zip ties, put one through. So you can always do the zip ties from the top or the bottom. The bottom's a little bit harder just because, you know, it's a little bit less room to work with. So what you can do is you run it through this way, flip it over, wrap it around, come back through the top, and let's just double check where we want it before we tighten it down. So we'll push our antenna back a little bit, come in here with it, see how we're doing on space. Looks good there, so we'll just tighten it down. That way you can see everything's going to line up just perfect. If you see that you're having a little bit of hard time putting anything in above your receiver, you can take the case off your receiver and put heat shrink on it instead. But like I said, it is a tight fit, but it does fit. So with that one in place, we can go ahead and run our next zip tie. And finally our wrap strap will be last. So in the wrap strap, these holes are made to where it does fit. Just takes a little bit of work to get it through. Just gonna pull it up a little bit. Pull this back on our antenna, because you'll notice nothing's really tight yet. The antenna can still move freely. And that just allows us to have a little bit of room to work with. Alright, so with that lined up, come down here, get it finessed back into spot. So now while I'm holding this top plate here, I'll go ahead and get it put in place. Let's get a couple screws to hold it down. That way nothing moves around whenever we tighten down our antenna. So just do the back screws, because these front screws are going to be using a 20mm screw through those other standoffs. Just got 2 screws to hold it in. Now we can just go ahead, tighten down our straps, and trim up everything. Now, like we talked about, there's a bunch of different ways to do this. It's just the way we choose to, or at least the way I'm choosing to set it up in this video, just to make it a little bit easier. Now with our antenna secured, now we can go ahead and get the other screws and finish tightening down our middle plate. Let's line our camera back up before our wires get out of the way. There we go. So that's in place, our OSD cable's in place. Tighten our frame down. Alright, middle plate's in. Next thing we can do is get our small top plate. This will be going on next. We need our 2 20mm screws. and our standoffs that have no threads inside. So the easiest way that I've found to do this is kind of take your top plate, run the 20mm screw through it, get the standoff, line it up here, and then just kind of set your top plate down on your camera plate. And since it's there, tighten down to 20mm. Don't want to get it too tight yet, just in case we need to move it around a little bit. That's pretty good. Spin around the frame, move our OSD cable to the other side, and slide in our little spacer. Put the screw through it, snug it down, and with the back screws on, now we can put the two front screws in. So our frame is put together. The next thing we want to do is we have these two pads. Our battery pad being custom made for this frame is actually not complete yet. So what we chose to do is we have these little pads here that work really actually pretty awesome, and they honestly keep the price of the frame from, you know, as cheap as we can get it. So we always take one, line it up here right between. You can either use these slots for your Velcro, or like I do, I just tend to wrap the plate. So we'll just line it up here, come right back to the front of these screws, get our scissors, and this is where we're going to cut it. So just made a little notch so we know where to go, and cut that end off. And same thing, we're going to line it up, cut this end off. Now you'll notice we have a couple extra pieces here. So remember before I talked about I don't put anything under my ESCs right now. However, if you wanted to, you could, and that's where these come into play. So if you wanted to put any kind of padding underneath your ESCs, you just cut them in half, and now you have little pads for your ESCs. But you know, like I said, I haven't done that for quite a while and haven't needed to, so we'll peel the bottom sticky part off of the first pad, get it lined up and stuck down. Now you can either leave it at one, or like I do, I like to go ahead and, you know, double layer it just to have another little shock absorber there for our batteries. The batteries we tend to use on this quad are a little bit more on the pricey side, however it's well worth it, and that's actually these, the Hyperion 4-cell 2800 milliamp. They're a high voltage, and we're able to get almost 13 minutes out of this if we were just kind of cruising along. And you'll notice I designed the frame to fit these perfectly on that back plate. So with that out of the way, we have the battery pads in. Next part we can go through is get our heat shrink. Be 4 pieces in the kit, and some of our zip ties here. And the way I like to do it is we'll take one of our antennas, we'll mount it vertically up the back here, and the other one will come straight out the back. So to keep it on the inside of the frame away from any kind of prop strikes, I like to feed it through, get it lined up here. Same thing with this other side, we'll just go ahead and feed it through. And once they're there, we use our zip ties. For this one side, it's going to be pretty easy. Just feed it through the standoff. We'll cinch it right down on the standoff itself. And so this antenna here will actually just go straight down the standoff, and we'll heat shrink it into place. And then for this next one, it's going to be a little bit different. We're going to take 2 zip ties, we're going to wrap it around this short standoff without tightening them all the way down. So leave a little loose. I'm going to do it twice. So just got 2 loops here. Then we're going to take our third zip tie, with the big end, feed it down through. If your zip ties are too tight, you can feed it the other direction. Or leave it to where it's flush with the bottom plate. So tighten up the zip ties on top of that. If you need a friend to give you a hand, not a bad idea. Tighten these down. There we go. These two zip ties that are horizontal on this side, we can trim them so we don't need all this extra. So cut this off. And all these are going to do is going to allow these zip ties to act like, you know, just antenna supports. So we'll start with this one here, the vertical one. Line it up. Leave just a little bit of zip tie over top of the antenna, just for a little extra safety. Take our heat shrink. Want to line our heat shrink up. Same thing again, cut just a little extra off. So we don't need all of that. Take a second piece, line the second piece up, cut it down, and this is how we're going to secure our antennas. So take the one heat shrink, line it up. We're going to take our heat gun. Whenever we're heating this up, you can actually heat up the bottom here and bend it up a little bit more to get it up out of the prop strikes. So we'll take the second piece that we've already cut down, layer it right over top. All this is doing is helping it be a little bit more rigid than it would with only one piece. So that'll work for the vertical. And the next thing we're going to do is just the same thing again, except we're going to line up this one on the side. Don't really need to cut anything down off of it because it will actually go all the way to the end. Using our heat shrink, line it up. So we'll see how much extra we got here. Not really. So we'll just leave it as is. Get it lined up and shrink it in. And if we have a little bit extra, we can always cut it off after. And just like before, we'll take the second piece, line it over, and shrink it down as well. Just filling here on the end, we got a little bit of excess, so I just cut it down, just being sure that our antenna is actually not there. Move this stuff out of the way. Next thing we can do is one of the last steps, get our battery Velcro, and we can run it and have it installed. Doesn't really matter how you do it. Like I said, I tend not to use the Velcro holes. Just slide it under the top plate. This allows me to have a little bit of flexibility to where I place it, depending on which batteries I'm using. I always like to alternate where my little rings are, so one on one side, one on the other. And just making sure I don't have anything caught between the Velcro and the frame. Put this up inside here. Have our OSD, and our quadcopter is assembled. So the next thing is going to be to hook it up to a computer, get everything programmed into the flight controller and the ESCs, and then we'll be ready to take it out for a flight. All right, now that we have our build complete, the next thing we can do is actually hook it up to our computer and get everything programmed. We'll start first with using Betaflight and get our flight controller ready to go. So first thing we want to do is we'll just go ahead and plug it in, and on the left side here you have your USB port. Listen to the buzzer make some noise. You want to make sure it is a data cable, because some USB cables are only for charging, you know, GoPros, things like that. So if it's not connecting, that might be why. So we can see here it actually connected, but the first thing we want to do is just go ahead and update the firmware. The DYS F4 board is considered an Omnibus F4, so we'll just click that. Get our most up-to-date firmware. I prefer to use stable versions. You can actually click unstable releases, and this is how people are getting turtle mode and a few other functions, but until it's actually stable, especially on my chase platforms, I prefer just go with the one we know is going to work fine. Come down here, click load firmware online. It'll take just a minute. Once flash firmware is able to be clicked, just click it and listen to a buzzer for a minute. It's a little bit annoying, but it goes through racing. It'll flash the board and it'll pop up telling you it's been successful. Alright, so now once it says program is successful, it should automatically pop up. We're using a Mac, so we get this TTY.USB modem. If you're on Windows, it'll tell you actually a COM port, and depending on which one it is, it should automatically pop up here. So now that we are good, we'll hit connect. It'll connect to the board. And right as soon as this screen pops up, just go ahead and click calibrate accelerometer. It just takes a second. It'll level itself out if it's not already. Then we can move on down to ports. Now on the ports, remember on the T6 pad we soldered in the microphone, the white wire. So this is for smart audio. So on UART 6, we'll go over to peripherals. On disabled, click it, go down to TBS smart audio. And then for our S-Bus, for serial RX, we'll put it on UART 1. So just click that, and then we want to save and reboot. You hear the beeps, click connect. Ports tab, everything's saved. Now we're going down to configuration. And be on Quad X. For our protocol, I've always been running multi-shot here on our chase quad. And our minimum throttle usually ends up running right around 1024. Scrolling down, PID loop, 8K for this board. Mainly if you want to use any kind of level mode, you can just leave the accelerometer on, and then later in the CLI we can actually input a command that will allow us to arm the quad in any angle. Going down, serial based receiver, Spectrum 2048. Staying on the left side. And we'll go down through here, black box. We do have a black box on this. Turn our air mode on. It has the Betaflight OSD, so we'll leave it on. VBAT, so for me on this build I use high voltage batteries, and if it actually is over 4.3 volts per cell, you're going to get an alarm while you're flying. So I always jump this up to about 4.8, and then that way it's not going to scream at us. And then the warning cell voltage means that if a battery drops below 3.5 volts per cell, it's actually going to buzz and beep while we're flying to let us know. And everything else is good. Our flight controller does have a current sensor, so we can turn it on and hit save and reboot. Same thing again, you hear the beeps, click connect. Go to PID tuning. And so for me, when we start out, I always just kind of leave the PIDs how they are, and honestly for the most part it's usually pretty close. The one thing I do change is my rate and super rate. So for chase quad, I always put 1.02, 0.8, 0.8 on this next one. Y'all, I run 1.2 and 0.75. And that's pretty much all we're going to do on the PID settings. And like I said, anytime we change something, you always want to hit save. It will not reboot on this screen. We'll go on down to a receiver tab. Since we are using Spectrum on our channel map, click the arrow, change it over to Spectrum, and hit save again. Then we'll set up our modes. So modes tab, I always have pretty much the same setup on everything I fly. So my arm is always going to be auxiliary 1, and I want it to be in the high range. Angle and horizon will be both on auxiliary 2. Angle will be the low range. Horizon will be mid, and then when you go to the higher range on that same switch, it'll actually put you into rate mode. And then the one last thing that we'll set up will be our beeper, and that'll be on auxiliary 3. And same thing, we'll hit it up on the high range and hit save. And next thing we want to do is come down to OSD. OSD, you can kind of set up how you want, how you prefer to see things on your screen. For me, I don't need fly mode. I don't want the horizontal sidebars or the artificial horizon. I will keep the main battery voltage the on time, so this is the whole time the quad is actually plugged in, and then the fly time is just how long it's been armed. So we'll leave those two. Current draw, milliamp hour draw, and that's pretty much all I like to use. Drag our voltage down to the right. I keep the amperage right in the middle, milliamp drawn, and then my timers I'll leave on the right side. Kind of move everything around. And then video format, just do auto. Whether you want imperial or metric, RSSI. Battery that we're using is 2800. Flight time, and all this is doing is, like, if you're flying and you reach a certain time, it's going to flash and let you know. So for me, 10 minutes is fine. Hit save, or actually if you go into font manager, you can change up everything as far as making it bold, large, extra large, and you can see in the background here how everything's changing. So I just like default, but feel free to play with that, see what you prefer. Hit save. And the last thing we're going to do is go into CLI. Want to type in set space small underscore angle equals 180. Hit enter. Then we'll type in save and hit enter again. And all that's going to do is, at any angle that your quad is, it's going to allow you to pretty much arm it. So if you're upside down in a tree, you flip that switch and it's going to arm. You're going to be able to throttle up and try to get out of the tree a little bit. All right, now once we get done with everything we just did, we finished up CLI. So the next thing I want to do before we check motor direction or anything is I want to flash our ESCs. So we'll click over to BL Heli, and again, BL Heli configurator, Betaflight is all in your Chrome App Store. We are still connected, so you hit connect, it comes up. Now for this setup, this next step, you actually have to have a battery plugged in. So we got our Hyperion 2800. This is the one that we actually use to chase with. Gives us the best flight time, and obviously it is heavy, it is a brick, but we're looking for more endurance than actually power. So plug this in, boots up, hit read setup. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to want to flash the firmware on all of our ESCs. So I come down here on the right side, we're going to hit flash all. Right here on the ESC, do not change this. This just is selecting which type of ESC you're using. Now on version, so we'll go right there, 16.67 RC. So the newest version, and hit flash. You can see it scroll through everything. Takes just a minute. Alright, now that all the firmware is flashed to all 4 ESCs, come over here on the left side, beacon delay. Right now it's set for 10 minutes. If you drop it down to 2 minutes, it seems like a little fast. So at 5 minutes, what it's going to do is, if we crash in the field and we can't find it, for some reason our buzzer isn't working, something, pretty much after 5 minutes, the ESCs are going to start making a noise and help you locate your quad. But obviously it's only going to work if the battery stays on. And then over on the right side, 9 times out of 10, ESC 2 and 3, when I set it up this way, are reversed. So we come in here, we'll hit reverse, reverse, and then right setup. And if we're right, then we won't have to come back into BL Heli once we check the motors here in a second. So everything is written, we'll hit disconnect. So now we're done with BL Heli, we'll unplug our battery, click back over to Betaflight, we'll connect it, go to our motors tab. Alright, with our prop still off, come over here, click on the you understand the risks, and all propellers are removed. Take your master slider, slide it all the way up. Now again, our battery is still unplugged. So with the slider all the way up, plug our battery in, listen for the tones. All we're doing right now is calibrating the ESCs. Tones are finished. Drag the master slider to the bottom. Tones are complete. So now all I want to do is just double check my minimum throttle. So just click the master slider. I always just use my up arrow, come up to about 1024, and you can see that our motors are spinning, and they're actually spinning very smoothly. So this is what we're going to call our minimum throttle, so we don't have to change anything. But now we can check our motor direction. So no matter which way your quad's facing, as long as the front or the back is towards you, the bottom right motor will be clockwise, top left will be counterclockwise, bottom left counterclockwise, and top left will be clockwise. So all of our directions are correct. So we got lucky when we switched it in BL Heli, and so now we're done. We can just drop our master slider switch down, turn that back off. We can unplug our battery, and at this point we'll get our transmitter set up, and once it's set up we can bind it through the quad. So now we'll take our radio. We're using a DX9, so turn it on. Once it boots up, pops up on a model, hit your clear and your back button at the same time. Go down to add a new model. Yes, we want to create a model. So we can come down to model type, click it, and we're going to click airplane. Data will be reset, yes. Model name, this is where we come in. We can change it to whatever we want to. And instead of sitting here listening to the beeps, I'll just put some symbols in, that way I know that this is our model, and hit back. Channel sign, this is what we're looking for. So you see gear is gear, aux1, aux2, aux3, aux4. Next, channel input configuration. Gear within Betaflight is going to be pretty much aux1. aux1 is going to be 2, aux2 is going to be 3, and so forth. So on gear, I always use my arm button is F right here. So click it to where it's flashing and just flip the switch. Once you flip the switch, push the scroll wheel down again to lock it in. aux1, I want to use C, so it's flashing. Flip the switch, changes, hit back. Rather, made a mistake. But anyway, it's still locked in, so while it's flashing, flip the switch. Once you flip the switch, click your scroll wheel. aux2, we're going to change to our buzzer. Push it when it's flashing. Flip your switch. I always use the back one here. So flip it. It changes over to A. Push your scroll wheel, and our channel input is done. Scroll down, just checking if there's anything else we need to set up. Looks good here. We can just go back, and it reboots. So now it's rebooted. We'll turn our radio off, and we'll be ready to bind. Now our DYS F4 flight controller, we can actually bind it only by using the USB power. So we'll just take our USB cord, plug it back in, and we'll look back here at our receiver. Took a minute, but now our receiver is flashing, so it's in bind mode. So we'll set our quadcopter down, get our radio. We have our bind switch. You want to hold it down, get it away from your quadcopter a little bit, and turn it on. It'll come up, it'll bind. As soon as she tells you that it's binding, you can let go of the bind button.
Bind complete.
Bind is complete. So we'll let it sit here. Now we go back into Betaflight and just check everything's working as intended. So hit connect, come down to our receiver tab, and looking at our receiver tab, you see our throttle is all the way down, but it's showing 1159. All the way up, it's showing 1840. So we want to run that from 1000 to 2000. Same thing on all of our other axes, but you can see there, yaw is actually backwards. If you do roll, roll is backwards as well. Pitch is correct, other than the fact that the endpoints are wrong. So we don't have to disconnect or anything. We just leave it into Betaflight. Pick up your transmitter, push your scroll wheel to go into the menu, and we're going to come down to servo setup. Push your button again, and travel. So with our throttle all the way down, you'll notice it highlights the bottom number. Throttle all the way up highlights the top number. So leave it down. We're going to change all these numbers to 147. So while it's flashing, click it and scroll through. 147, throttle all the way up. Same thing again, 147. Now we're going to go over to aileron. Same thing, it selects both. Push it, go to 147. Elevator to 147. Rudder to 147. Now while we're in this menu, go back up to travel. It starts flashing. Scroll over to reverse. Push your scroll wheel, and we need to reverse our aileron and our rudder. And look back up here at our monitor. You'll notice throttle goes from 999 to 2001, and all of our other stick directions are correct. So now we'll check our auxiliary switches. So F, if you remember, we changed it. That is our gear. This should be our aux 1, and you can see how it actually changes. So down, and then we wanted it all the way up to be arm. So that would be arm. Aux 2 should be C, which it is. So down will be auto level, horizon mode in the middle, rate mode all the way up, and then finally our buzzer. And our buzzer is actually backwards from what I like. So we can just actually go over to our modes tab, down to beeper, drag this down to the low end and hit save. Then now, whenever it's away from us, beeper's off. Pull it towards you, beeper comes on. So just hit save, and everything else is good. So what we'll do is we'll come in here to receiver tab one more time, and we're going to plug in a battery. And all we want to do is, once this comes in, we'll arm it just to ensure it's going to arm. So it arms, everything looks like it's good. Little rocks on the stick. Make sure we have all functions. Disarm it, and we just hit back to get back out of our menus and back to the beginning. So at this point, we're done with the computer. Betaflight's done. Flight controller, ESCs, everything's ready to go. We could actually take it outside and fly it right now, but we still have our OSD cable hanging in our camera. So what we want to do is change our camera settings, or we'll not really change the settings, but the camera has an OSD on itself that we will disable since we have a OSD on our flight controller. So we'll grab a set of goggles and we'll go through that setup now. All right, for this next part, we're going to go through and, like I said, turn off the RunCam Swift 2 internal OSD. So we have a nice little handy screen here. Prop it up. We can plug in our battery. Turn the transmitter on just so it's on. Should have done that first. Anyway, if you look at the screen here, you can see at the very top amp. So it shows our amp draw, but then on the left side you're seeing pretty much double voltage. So the little numbers are our Betaflight OSD, the big numbers are the RunCam OSD. It says big RunCam in the middle. Same thing on the right side. We have actually 3 different timers. We have 2 small timers and the big timer. So we want to turn all that off. So we have our OSD cord that we hooked up during the build, and it's got this little joystick. And the way we want to do it is, if you look on the stick, it says up and down. Put it in your hand to where you're going to hold up, down, left, or right. And to be honest, I can't remember which does which. If you hold it one direction, it's going to change something. So we'll go with holding it down to start with. So holding down highlights the RunCam and allows you to move it around. And to stop moving it, just click it. And then if you hold left, left allows you to move the voltage. So click it to put it in place. Right obviously is going to change our timer and allow us to move our timer, so we'll just scroll it up here. And so you can see the 3 parts of the RunCam OSD. So now we know the last one to do is to hold it up. We hold it up, it's going to take us into our OSD menu. And with this, you can change the name. So you can actually change the word RunCam to whatever your pilot name is, or pretty much anything you want to say. We'll scroll down here, pilot. It can be on or off. Our timer can be on or off. Voltage can be on or off. So we're turning it all off, and we're going to exit. Once we exit, now you can see we do have just the Betaflight OSD, and everything is good to go. So at this point, we're done pretty much with all of the setup. We can unplug everything, install our props, and go outside and have a test fly. All right, now we have our props, which on this build, I've been using the HQ 6x45 PC polycarbonate props. Pretty much they're really difficult to break. I honestly haven't broke one yet. They usually just bend up and you can bend them back into place. But for our setup, with these motors and these props on a 4-cell battery, max throttle, you're only going to get about 25 amps. So it's a really efficient setup. We have our prop nuts here on the side. Ones that come with it are the gunmetal gray, and we still have our OSD cable installed here. So the easiest thing to do is, with the way we install our OSD cable, we can just pull it straight out. Comes out, we can lay it to the side, put it up for something later. Take our props and we'll get those installed. And just like before, with our back of our quad pointing to us, the bottom right motor is going to be clockwise. So looking under our prop, we have the numbers up on top, 6x45R. And then we have numbers on top, 6x45. So if you're looking at that, the R is going to be on the right bottom and the left top. And the high side of the prop is going to be turning into the wind, so that's going to allow you to know that it's going to be clockwise. So we'll put that one on first. Always do one prop at a time, that way we're sure that we're not going to forget to tighten one prop nut up. So get our prop tool. You want to get it tight without really over tightening, which sounds weird, but it can be done. So the way I check is just hold your motor and try to spin your prop by hand. And if you can't, then you know you're good. Oh, keep the same direction. Again, clockwise on the top left. Get our prop nut. Get this installed. And we'll get the last two installed and we'll be ready to go for a maiden flight. All right, with our props installed and our pallet ready to go, we can go out and do a maiden flight. All right, here we are, fast forward, I don't know, probably 5 days later. The weather finally cleared up and now we can do our maiden flight. The way I do the maiden flight is first do everything line of sight. We want to pretty much put it on the ground, back away from it 20, 25, 30 feet. I apologize for the airplane in the background here. And pretty much you're going to hover it and just check orientation. Make sure all your controls are correct. Making sure your self-level, your horizon, everything's working. So let's go ahead and start stepping through that process. Have your transmitter turned on. We have our arm switch off, throttle's all the way down. Plug the quad in. I'm gonna set it out here on this brick. And we'll do a quick little hover test here. So arm it. Motor spin nice and smooth. Yaw's good. Roll's good. Pitch. So right now we are in full acro mode. So we'll check our horizon. So we can see we got self-leveling and fully self-level. Disarm it. Check our beeper. Everything looks great. So nice and simple. It takes 30 seconds to do and it can save you a lot of headaches. So we'll go under the goggles and do a quick maiden flight finally. And real quick before we take off, you can see in the DVR, we got a OSD right now looking at us. If we hold our throttle to the middle, yaw all the way left, and then pitch up, it's going to put us into this pretty much menu system. Now earlier when we set up our smart audio, this is how you can go in and change your actual channels and everything. So go down using your pitch to features, roll to the right to go through it. Go down, SA is smart audio, so that's our TBS, and TR is tramp. So if you're using the tramp, you can do it that way too, but we're a smart audio, so VTX, right. You can change your band, you can change which channel you're on. You can change it by frequency, and you can change power. So right now we're on 25 milliwatt. You got 200, 500, and 800. So we'll go ahead and just, bring it all the way up. So, because, why not? Come up to set, go right, confirm, yes. Go down, just back, and we can back all the way out. Now again, you can go through this whole system. There's a lot of things you can do. We want to save and reboot. It'll reboot everything. And now we're ready to go. So now our VTX is on 800 milliwatt. You can see our voltage in the bottom left corner, timer's on the right. Arm it, and let's have a little bit of fun. Now remember, we have not tuned this at all. And what I like about it is even without tuning, these new boards are actually really good. So for the most part, it allows you to have a really smooth flying experience without really having to know too much about what you're doing. So while we're flying here, the battery we're using is the same thing we had in the build video earlier. It's a 2800 2800 milliamp hour Hyperion, high voltage. And it's, like we said, it's really heavy, but you can tell that the quad doesn't care. It still behaves. The only thing is it takes a little bit more throttle, especially when you're trying to pull out of a dive like this. Full throttle to get out of it. So you just got to be aware of it. But as far as flight time, if we're cruising around pretty much like this, we're going to be able to get close to 13 minutes. 10 minutes easy at least. Pair this up with a crossfire and go long range, and it's so fun. But it's nice to get back into the nice long flight times, not having to worry about running low on battery in 2 minutes. All right, nice, simple build. I mean, it's a little bit into it, like any quad build. Take your time, one step at a time. Just concentrate on the thing you're doing. Don't think too far ahead. It can get overwhelming, especially when you first started into this hobby. So go along with the video. If you have any questions, put it in the comments. We'll try to get back to you. If you need help building, we have actually a repair service that just went live. It's flitetest.com/repairs. And we can help you through it. If you want this built, also we have it on the store. Custom builds, we have this exact build ready to go. So I hope you learned something. Appreciate you watching. Catch you next time.